The BOB APB plugin from McDSP brings the ultra-low frequency processing capabilities of the McDSP BOB module from the 6060 Ultimate Module Collection plugin into the APB hardware platform. The APB is McDSP's analog processing box, and it's the world's first programmable analog processor. APB features include premium analog components, multiple analog saturation circuits, and AKM 32-bit DAC and ADC converters that process your audio straight from your DAW via a Thunderbolt connection. APB channels are controlled with sample-accurate precision by a growing collection of APB plugins that support AAX native, AU, and VST3 formats. Users can create presets, automate parameters, and restore sessions instantly, while still having the sound of real analog processing in their mixes. BOB stands for Bass Optimized Bias, and its response is achieved in the APB format using a combination of digital processing and a two-stage analog signal path. Additional signal level dynamics are generated by the award-winning APB analog circuitry to bring out details not available in the original BOB module. Like the original BOB module, the BOB APB plugin includes bias and frequency controls for enhancing a signal's low end, alongside squash and rate controls for applying frequency selective compression in one of two modes. New controls on the BOB APB plugin are analog gain, 2 analog modes, and headroom. More metering options are available too, and they include overall gain reduction, squash gain reduction, input level, and output level. Before we hear some audio examples, let's check out each of BOB's controls in more detail. Let's move through BOB's UI left to right, section by section, starting with the bias and frequency knobs. Bias adjusts the amount of low frequency boost at the frequency selected by the frequency knob, labeled FREQ. The shape of the boost at this frequency is dependent on the selected bias mode, which will be discussed in more detail soon. Regardless of the selected bias mode though, frequencies below the targeted frequency will be filtered out so that the bass optimized bias is only applied at and above the target frequency. To the right of the bias and frequency knobs are the squash and rate knobs, both of which manipulate the plugin's frequency selective compression. Squash controls the amount of compression at approximately the frequency selected by the frequency knob. This compression's attack and release times are determined by the rate knob. Similar to the bias and frequency knobs, the shape of this compression is determined by the selected bias mode. The two different bias modes set the shape of the overall bass optimized bias, and they are selectable via the A and B buttons to the right of the rate knob. Mode A is a broad low frequency emphasis with a peak at the selected bias frequency, while Mode B is a more targeted low frequency emphasis with a peak at the selected bias frequency. The next section of the BOB APB plugin is where the real analog saturation circuitry within the APB shines, and it contains the gain knob along with analog mode options. First, the gain knob sets the amount of analog gain applied to the bass optimized bias signal. Turn this knob up for some analog saturation perfectly tuned for saturating low-end heavy tracks such as 808s. The style of this effect is further modified by the analog mode options that are selectable by the buttons labeled 1 and 2, both of which also configure the analog circuitry to provide analog boost and dynamic compression. When neither analog mode is selected, analog boost and dynamic compression are gentle, the saturation region is larger, and some low end is kept from going into the saturation circuit. When analog mode 1 is on, analog boost and dynamic compression are stronger, and the saturation region is smaller. Note that analog saturation can be more or less audible when analog mode 1 is off or on, as results will depend greatly on the incoming signal. When analog mode 2 is on, the analog circuitry's calibration is adjusted to allow for more low-end saturation. Use this mode in combination with high gain knob settings for extreme low-end saturation effects. Lastly, remember that you can enable both analog modes 1 and 2 at the same time to achieve all of the previously mentioned effects at once. The final knob on the BOB UI is the Headroom knob labeled Trim/HR all the way to the right, which assists with gain staging at the plugin's output stage. It controls the amount of digital trim between -20 dB and 0 dB, or the amount of analog headroom between 0 dB and +20 dB. The final element of the BOB UI that we'll cover are its two VU meters. On the left side of the UI is a gain reduction meter that shows the plugin's overall gain reduction amount when the GR button is selected, and the squash gain reduction amount when the SQR button is selected. The VU meter on the opposite side of the plugin displays the level at the plugin's input stage when the in button is selected, and the level at the plugin's output stage when the out button is selected. When operating the BOB plugin in stereo, note that these meters show the maximum gain reduction and signal level for the left and right channels. Now to hear more of BOB in action on some audio examples. Let's start off with an 808 example, which has a very clean sound and is also quite low in the frequency spectrum, which means it'll be very hard to hear on small speakers. In this example, we're boosting 38 Hz on bias mode A. We're also controlling the low end of this signal by turning up the squash knob to about 60% and using a 200 millisecond time on the rate knob. The actual attack time will be faster than 200 milliseconds and is somewhat frequency dependent, while the actual release time will be roughly 200 milliseconds. Although the gain knob isn't turned up in this example, as we're getting plenty of beautiful analog saturation without it, a clean signal like this is the perfect opportunity to show off just how far we can push the analog saturation circuitry within the APB. Let's give it a shot by slowly turning up the gain knob on analog mode 2 to send more low-end frequencies into the saturation. Let's try getting a similar sound on this drum bus. This time, we're boosting 35 Hz, increasing the analog gain using the gain knob, and using analog modes 1 and 2 at the same time. That means we're pushing more low end than usual into the APB's analog saturation circuitry with mode 2, while also strengthening the analog boost and dynamic compression with mode 1. This example is the perfect opportunity to hear the creative pumping effects that analog mode 1 is capable of producing, so let's play around with it. In this case, not only are we using BOB to add some extra power and saturation to these drums, but we're also adding some unique pumping effects that bring some intensity to this track. BOB is also great for situations where your low end needs a boost, but you don't care to saturate it much, if at all. Here's another quick drum bus example where we're doing just that while making the transients more snappy with analog mode 1. When the plugin is engaged, notice the way that the low end and overall power of the drums not only intensify, but the overall volume of the track stays about the same. This allows for seamless A/B comparisons while dialing in the plugin. For our final example, let's try adding some much needed body to this mix bus. We're using BOB on this mix to boost 67 Hz while cranking the squash knob up pretty high on bias mode A to make sure the low end doesn't get too out of control. We're also shooting for some additional harmonics in the low end, which Analog Mode 2 is helping us achieve by saturating more of the low end portion of the signal. Next time your mix is lacking that low end punch that it really needs in order to make it shine, look no further than the BOB APB plugin. It's got you covered for creative bass saturation effects, general low end enhancement, and more. Interested in learning more about BOB, the APB, and the rest of our APB plugin line? Check out McDSP.com/APB for more info. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more McDSP tips and content. Also, feel free to use the links in the description to follow us on other social media platforms. We will see you next time.